Jesse Livermore, November 28, 1940, the Sherry Netherland Hotel. 11 years earlier, he made $100 million shorting the crash. He had the edge. You don't. So why do you think you'd survive what he couldn't? 5 men got rich during the Great Depression. Their names are known. Their transactions are documented. The prices they paid, the returns they collected, the specific structural conditions that made each trade possible, all of it is on the record. This video is going to give you their receipts, not the mythology, not the inspiration poster version, the actual numbers. But there is a second thing this video is going to do that most retellings refuse to. It is going to tell you exactly why each one of those men could do what they did, and exactly why you couldn't have done it with them. Because getting rich during the Great Depression was not about courage. It was not about contrarian instinct or the nerve to buy when others panicked. Every man on this list had a specific structural edge, insider information, war chest capital, credentialed access to other people's money, or an inherited monopoly that was depression-proof by design. Most people in 1929 didn't have any of those edges. Most people in 1929 who tried to bottom buy went broke. Jesse Livermore went broke. Billy Durant, the man who founded General Motors, went broke. And in 2026, the people who do have those edges are already positioned, already patient, already waiting. This is what that looks like, then and now. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. entered 1929 with a net worth of approximately $4 million. By 1957, Fortune magazine listed him among the 15 richest Americans, with a fortune estimated between $200 million and $400 million. Time magazine confirmed he earned over $1 million from short selling alone during 1929 and 1930. In 1945, he bought the Chicago Merchandise Mart, at the time the largest commercial building in the world, for $13 million. His family trust sold it in 1998 for $625 million. Those are the numbers. Here is the mechanism. Kennedy ran stock pools. A stock pool was a coordinated scheme in which a group of wealthy investors collectively bought and sold a single stock in choreographed patterns, creating artificial volume and price movement that attracted retail buyers, who then held the position while the pool exited at the top. It was not a secret. It was standard practice. And it was legal, until June 1934, when Franklin Roosevelt signed the Securities Exchange Act. Roosevelt needed someone to chair the new Securities and Exchange Commission, someone who understood how the system was being gamed from the inside. He appointed Joseph Kennedy. The market manipulator was put in charge of writing the rules against market manipulation. Kennedy converted his insider edge into political access and regulatory authority. He locked in his fortune. He institutionalized it. Kennedy's edge was information, coordination, and connections that reached all the way to the White House. He had the edge. You don't. Floyd Odlum did not short the market. He did something in some ways more remarkable. He saw the crash coming and simply waited with cash. During the summer of 1929, Odlum sold roughly half of Atlas Corporation's holdings and issued $9 million in new securities, anticipating a market top. By the time the crash hit in October, he was one of the only major industrial operators in the country, holding approximately $14 million in liquid capital. Then he went shopping. Between 1930 and 1933, Atlas Corporation acquired 22 collapsed investment trusts at deep discounts, including Blue Ridge, Shenandoah, and the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation. These trusts had traded at enormous premiums before the crash. After it, their market prices collapsed, but their underlying assets, the stocks, bonds, and real property inside them, still had value. Odlum estimated he was buying cash-equivalent assets at approximately 60 cents on the dollar of net asset value. By 1933, Time magazine reported that Atlas Corporation had grown from $14 million to $121 million in 4 years. Odlum was one of the 10 wealthiest men in the United States. The mechanism was not genius, it was preparation. Odlum had the cash before anyone else needed to sell. He had the discipline to hold it through the entire manic summer of 1929, while everyone around him was getting richer by the week. And he had the institutional structure, Atlas Corporation, that gave him the credibility to acquire distressed assets at scale, rather than picking through individual stocks. Odlum had the war chest. You don't. John Templeton's story gets told as pure nerve. That is not quite accurate. In 1939, Templeton borrowed $10,000 from his boss at the brokerage firm Fenner and Bean. He used it to buy $100 worth of each of 104 NYSE-listed stocks trading below $1 per share. 34 of those companies were already in bankruptcy proceedings. Only 4 went to zero. He sold the portfolio over an average holding period of about 4 years, collecting approximately $40,000, a roughly 400% return. The edge Templeton had was credential-backed access to borrowed capital. He was inside a brokerage. He had a boss willing to lend. The average person trying to buy 104 bankrupt penny stocks in 1939 would have found the doors closed. Templeton walked in through the employee entrance. Howard Hughes is a different case entirely, and it matters to be precise about this. Hughes did not get rich during the Great Depression. He was already rich. In 1924, at age 18, he inherited approximately $1 million and the Hughes Tool Company, which held a mere monopoly patent on the oil drill bit used in virtually every major petroleum operation in the United States. That patent generated royalty income regardless of stock market conditions. When everyone else was being forced to sell, Hughes used that depression-proof cash flow to found Hughes Aircraft in 1932, operating out of a rented corner of a Lockheed hangar. He wasn't a depression opportunist. He was a monopoly beneficiary. He had the inherited patent. You don't. Every name on this list had something most people will never have. Kennedy had insider coordination and presidential access. Odlum had $14 million in pre-positioned cash. Templeton had brokerage credentials and borrowed capital. Hughes had a depression-proof monopoly he inherited at 18. And then there is Jesse Livermore, who had arguably the most powerful edge of all of them. And who lost everything anyway. Livermore is the most important name on this list. Not because of what he built, because of what destroyed him. And because the thing that destroyed him was built by the same man who profited most from his methods. Jesse Livermore's edge in 1929 was information asymmetry on a scale that no retail investor could approach. He maintained 30 private telephone lines connecting him in real time to market data from exchanges and brokerage operations across the country. While the average investor was reading yesterday's newspaper, Livermore was watching price movements unfold simultaneously across the entire country. He used that information to short the market with precision during the 1929 crash and emerged with approximately $100 million. That edge, private information networks producing real-time market intelligence unavailable to the public, would be classified as insider trading under the laws that govern markets today. In June 1934, those laws arrived. The Securities Exchange Act passed. The SEC was established. Its first chairman was Joseph Kennedy. Within 3 months of the act taking effect, Jesse Livermore filed for bankruptcy. His information network was severed. The structural advantage that had produced $100 million was now illegal. He never rebuilt. He never found another edge to replace it. On November 28, 1940, Jesse Livermore died by suicide in the cloakroom of the Sherry Netherland Hotel in Manhattan. He was 63 years old. He left a note describing his life as a failure. This is the thread that runs beneath every name on this list. Kennedy had information. Livermore had information. Kennedy converted his information advantage into political capital and used that capital to help write the rules. Livermore's information advantage was outlawed by those same rules. The man who benefited most from the methods became the regulator who criminalized them. Kennedy had the connections. Odlum had the capital. Hughes had the patent. Templeton had the access. You have patience, if you don't waste it pretending to be them. At the end of Q1 2026, Berkshire Hathaway held $397.4 billion in cash and short-term U.S. Treasury bills. That is the largest corporate cash position in the history of American markets. That position was not assembled in a panic. It was built across 13 consecutive quarters of net equity sales. Apple was trimmed from roughly 50% of Berkshire's portfolio to approximately 22%. Bank of America was cut by more than half. Warren Buffett spent the final years of his tenure as CEO systematically reducing equity exposure and accumulating cash. In 2025, he stepped back to chairman. Great Abel became CEO. Abel has continued the accumulation. This is not a coincidence. This is the same logic Floyd Odlum applied in the summer of 1929. Sell into strength, hold cash, wait for the dislocation, and be the buyer of last resort when the sellers are exhausted. Berkshire is not alone. Private equity dry powder, uncommitted capital sitting in funds waiting for the right entry, hit approximately $3.7 trillion at the start of 2026, according to Preqin. That is roughly double the 2019 figure. Ares Management alone held approximately $150 billion in private credit dry powder as of mid-2025. The largest pools of capital on the planet are already in cash, already patient, already waiting. The 2026 version of Floyd Odlum is not a person sitting at a kitchen table reading about Great Depression winners on YouTube. The 2026 version of Floyd Odlum is a $397 billion treasury bill position and $3.7 trillion in private equity fund structures that do not need to explain themselves to anyone until the deal closes. Those people have the war chest. You don't? Not at that scale. But the structural logic that built that war chest is not closed to you. Here is the uncomfortable conclusion. You are not Kennedy. You have no insider coordination, no path to a presidential appointment, no stock pool to run. You are not Odlum. You do not have $14 million in cash assembled before a generational crash. You are not Templeton. You are not inside a brokerage with a willing employer and a credential that opens doors. You are not Hughes. You did not inherit a drill bit monopoly at 18. And you are not Livermore. You do not have 30 private telephone lines. You do not have the information asymmetry. And even if you somehow built it, someone with better political connections than you would eventually be appointed to regulate it out of existence. Stop fantasizing about being the great bottom buyer. The one edge that remains, the only edge on this list that is still legal, still accessible, and still powerful enough to matter, is sustained patience and the discipline to hold dry powder through prolonged opportunity cost. That is not a romantic edge. It does not make for a good story at a dinner table. But it is the edge that Warren Buffett spent 50 years building into a $397 billion position before handing the keys to Greg Abel. The people who understand this will wait. They will hold. They will be ready when the dislocations arrive. Not because they are Odlum or Kennedy or Livermore, but because they stopped pretending to be. The people who don't understand it will watch Berkshire's cash pile from the outside and wonder why the smart money always seems to know something they don't. It does. It knows how to wait.